Abbie, why don't you start just talking about growing up and what was it in Charleston, wasn't it, that you grew up?
No, actually, I'm a military brat. So my 10 or 12 years in Charleston was as a young bride.
Awesome.
My dad was an Air Force fighter pilot, and he retired in '65. I'm one of 6 children, so I have 5 siblings, and a very Southern mother. So I'm a good combination of a Southern lady and a military father.
Oh, where did you fit in the 6 children?
Middle and mistreated, of course.
Okay.
I learned that years ago.
Well, I thought you might even be a first child.
No, it made being a military child and traveling around very easy because I had 2 or 3 older than I was to show me the way, and 2 or 3 to beat up or blame below me. So it worked well.
So when did you get interested in historic preservation?
As a young bride in Charleston, I thought everyone was into history. So I have always enjoyed it, and that was the impetus, the background for when I came to Ackworth and people didn't seem to be interested in our history, that sort of kicked me into the community activist mode.
Well, why don't you talk about buying the McMillan house in 1995?
That was a wonderful experience. We bought the McMillan home on Main Street. It was built in 1879, and it's an addition to an 1850s cabin. And Mr. James McMillan was a 3rd-generation Cobb Countian. His family had come to Mars Hill community, which is actually older than Ackworth. They came in the land lotteries in the 30s, and during the land lotteries, we gave preferential treatment to American Revolution veterans. And so his grandfather was a veteran. But by the time the 3rd generation, which was the 1870s and 1880s, the farm just could not support 3 full families. So that his range of brothers, and there were at least 3 more boys and 3 more girls, I believe, but many of them came to the city, which was Ackworth, to seek their fortune. And they really were that first wave moving from the agrarian farm life to city life.
So what did James McMillan do when he got to Ackworth?
James McMillan went in business with Jesse Lemon, who was his brother-in-law. His older sister was married to Jesse Lemon, and eventually opened his own McMillan. And they were a mercantile store, and they were located where Wild Blossoms is today. And then they expanded to the department store mode and moved into Henry's. And they had 4 big departments.
Oh, Henry's moved into them.
Oh, right.
Right. So they built the building to be a department store, or was it already there?
The building was already there. It was about 1906, and that's when that 2nd floor and the big facade was added to that particular building.
So he moved there in 1906 to be a store.
Right. It was about 1906. John Columbus Armstrong, who was a builder here in Ackworth and still have descendants here, he was a carpenter and a builder, and he enlarged the store, and we believe he was instrumental in building my house because it has many of the same elements that the Armstrong home has in Allatoona.
Now, your house, 1870s, but 1850s were part of it.
Right.
And so you think he built it in the 1870s?
Yes, we have letters. I have been very fortunate to meet the families, the McMillan descendants. And so they have shared with me pictures and photographs and letters. And so they have a letter written in the fall of '78 that James speaks, inviting his aunt and uncle to his wedding, something he didn't expect to do. and he married Emma Alice Lemon and enlarged the cabin to accommodate what would become a family with 10 children.
Okay. So was he, well, I mean, it's obviously a big house, and he was a young person at the time. Is this inherited money, or is he already making that much money in the retail business? Or how was he able to build such a nice house for his bride?
I believe the McMillan Mercantile Store was very successful. It was adjacent to his brother-in-law's Lemon Bank.
Well, marrying into the Lemon family probably helped explain some
He
of it.
probably married up, as they would say today. And he was 29 when he married, and Emma Alice was only 18. So I've always assumed my house was keeping up with the Joneses, the first edition for Ackworth. It has many similar elements, but not nearly as elegant as the Lemon home that exists today.
Now, I was in that house when it was on the market before you bought it, and you have obviously done a lot of work on it since you moved in there. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
It was a lot of fun rehabbing the house. First, I was lucky enough to have an architect who was very historic preservation minded and an engineer. So once they determined it was sound, it had good bones, the rehab was really, I spent more time taking faux history out of the house and debris. So we got it back to its natural state. And we were guided because during the rehab, the sisters, 3 McMillan descendant sisters who had lived in the house, actually were at Liberty Hill Cemetery for a family reunion, and they knocked on our door. So we made friends, they brought me pictures, and so we were able to use a lot of that information. But in his middle child's remembrances, she said that he spent $1,500 for the house and $1,500 for the gingerbread.
Okay.
I wanted to restore the gingerbread, but it came in at about $90,000, so I elected not to do that part.
Okay. Prices have gone up.
Haven't they, though?
Who was the architect for you?
Richard Say. He was on Cobb County's Historic Preservation Commission and an architect. And then Richard Thornton did a lot of the engineering for me. So we spent the whole day after closing with a crowbar taking off various elements that had been added.
Well, now, you said before we got started that your son is doing a lot of historic renovation type work now. You might have to get him back working on the house.
I have a couple of projects I would love to have him come back and do.
So how did John get his expertise in renovation? Did he get all that from you? Or?
No, actually, my husband, Boyd Parks, is very accomplished in household maintenance.
Oh, really?
He brags all the time that he still has his merit badge from plumbing. So as John grew up with Boyd, Boyd taught him a lot. He was very good with his hands, really understood mechanical things. So even though he is a degreed wildlife biologist, he is a handyman.
Oh, how about that? Well, now you said when you got to Ackworth in 1995 that nobody was interested in historic preservation. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? And how has that changed?
Historic preservation had a real strong supporting group of people in the 80s, in the 1980s. But many had moved away, and interest seemed to have waned, and it was not politically a priority or seen as a priority. And so the infrastructure for good historic preservation was already in place. It just wasn't being utilized. And then at the same time, the political climate changed. We had some new people move into town and some older residents take an interest. So they began working on the Main Street program for downtown development or downtown redevelopment. And that program's base is historic preservation. So the groundwork was there. I was just the cheerleader.
Well, now, in a lot of the interviews that we've done, people have talked about how 20 years ago, which 1995, that period, that downtown Ackworth was really down.
You could, when I bought my house in 95, you could roll a bowling ball down Main Street at high noon and not hit a person or a car. So there were a couple of shops, a rundown cafe of sorts, but not a real vital downtown.
To what extent do you think that historic preservation has been responsible for the economic resurgence in Ackworth?
I am sure it is paramount to our success. People enjoy the quaint sense of a home place, a sense of stepping back in time, and visually it's very attractive and very soothing. We in Ackworth have been indeed fortunate that because of I-75 and 41, a lot of the sprawl jumped us because of the lake and the confines of the lake. And so we kind of have the best of all worlds. We have our quaint historic core, both business and residential. And then over on 41, we have every big name box chain that you would ever want to see. So we kind of have the best. Then the city, with the downtown development impetus, began to elect officials that understood the historic quality. I recruited Tommy Alligood on Main Street one afternoon and made him join our historic society. And he actually decided to buy an old home, another McMillan home. So the mayor and I introduce each other as house-in-laws.
Okay. You say you recruited them on Main Street. Was this a stranger walking down the street and you just grabbed them off the street?
I think there was a little business expo on Main Street, and of course the Historic Society took a part in that. And so he stopped and asked what we were about, and I got his check and his sign up for so he bought an old home. He's restored it beautifully. And it's very similar to my son's home in Mobile. And he became active first in our downtown development and then as an alderman. And then I think he's on his third or fourth term as mayor.
Yeah, at least.
And so we are lucky. Our elected officials are very dedicated to the historic element in town.
How did the Collins Avenue Historic District come about?
When I talked my husband into buying the house on Main Street that needed so much work. And so he made me put together a bit of a business plan. And I did. And in that research, I found out that Cobb County has a very unique tax incentive for historic restoration. So I investigated that, got the details, and then began to share that information with my neighborhood. And the incentives are dramatic. Cobb County offers a 10-year freeze on your property taxes. And in the 90s, you were getting reassessed every 3 to 5 years. So it was a substantial savings. And once my neighborhood understood the tax incentives, because there were no restrictions, all you had to do was be on the National Register and the local register of historic places, and then all you had to do was apply. So we gathered together and created the district. And the city already had the Historic Commission.
And so a lot of nice houses. Why don't you talk about the female architect that was responsible for at least the plans for some of those Collins Avenue houses?
Well, I learned as an administrator in medical offices and medical practices that you don't have to be an expert, but you surround yourself with experts. And so the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation had guided us into hiring a professional. So each of the homeowners did a little bit of research about our homes, but then we got in the professional through the trust to actually formally apply for our National Register designation. And she unveiled a lot. And the theme for our district is 150 years of vernacular Southern architecture. So it goes all the way from an 1838 cabin, actually a hall and parlor, all the way to the 20s and 30s with the bungalows. And the bungalows were built in 1927 by a gentleman who had come south. And Mr. Keenel was unusual from the standpoint that in the Deep South he was a Yankee, he was a Catholic, and he was a Republican. There were no white Republicans in Georgia in the 20s. So coming to town, he decided to bring his 2 mill managers and ended up building 4 bungalow homes, one for himself, one for his brother-in-law who was his partner, and then 2 for his mill managers. And he chose a female architect who is now quite famous, Lila Ross Wilburn. She's noted to have built a number of houses in Marietta and in Inman Park and in downtown Atlanta and even on Peachtree. So she had not been formally trained as an architect, but had studied in Chicago, I believe. And she worked out of Atlanta. And they used her plan book, Ideal Homes of Today, for the homes.
There has to be a story of how he found out about Lila and Ross Wilburn.
At the same time, subsequently, I have found out that Lila built 2 or 3 on large houses in Marietta. And there's one in Cartersville. So she was working her way this way. And apparently she was known for not associating so much with architects, but with builders and construction companies, which obviously led to her success. She practiced from the teens to the 60s, long before Georgia Tech ever graduated a female architect.
Long before.
Long before.
Talk about the Cowan House and your involvement with that.
The Cowan House was built in the 1840s by Stephen D. Cowan. And before Tommy was mayor, we had a female mayor named Marcia Andruzzi. She was very well educated in historic preservation, in small town business. And Marcia involved me in the Cowan House and the Historic Society. And so after many condemnation trials, we finally were able to acquire the house, donated to the Historic Society, and then working with Mayor Alligood, he acquired the essential additional lot, which we needed to make the house viable as a business. And we passed it at that point on to the Georgia Trust, who have a revolving plan for historic properties. So it was a long and arduous battle, but very successful. And it's a beautiful rehab.
When did you get involved with Cobb Landmarks?
20 years ago.
As soon as you got here?
It was not long after I moved here that Cobb Landmarks had contacted the McMillan descendants and consequently me to host our annual meeting. So the Cobb Landmarks organization, which was about 20 years old at the time, came to
74 it was founded.
came to Ackworth, and they had their annual meeting in our First Presbyterian Church, which was built in the 1870s. And then I had my neighbors open a few houses on Collins, and we sort of had a rotating reception at two of the Lila Ross Wilburn homes and my home. So it was the next year that they invited me to the board, and they're not through with me yet because I chair next year.
And this is not your first time?
No, sir. I have enjoyed my tenure with Cobb Landmarks.
And Cobb Landmarks is a county-wide organization, but certainly Marietta focused for many years. How have you been involved in getting Cobb Landmarks more involved in other parts of the county?
Mostly because of the Ackworth adventure. They came up and saw that small towns there's 6 small towns in Cobb, and they needed to expand, and reaching out to the community for different board members made a big difference. And so we had people from Marietta, but we also had people who were from Smyrna on the board, and slowly but we've become a much broader scope through annual awards, programs, and outreach. We offer at Cobb Landmarks a tremendous amount of technical expertise. Even the city of Ackworth has used our expertise to rehabilitate this building and to furnish it.
I was going to ask you to talk about this Logan Farm location where we are today. How did that all come about, and what all was involved in trying to restore this building?
It was a tremendous effort on the part of the city, and they did it with SPLOS funding. Actually, one of the best things about the downtown development and the historic preservation groups being active, we were able to elect officials who were interested, and they surrounded themselves with experts. So we were indeed fortunate when the city hired a Ron Huffman to design a master plan for the lake. And that has grown and it's grown and it's grown. So he was involved in planning for our city hall downtown. He was involved, I think, with our LCI. He's been involved with our Logan Farm. And he is now involved with our expansion of Main Street and the boulevard and our railroad crossings. So he was able to discuss the historic value of the building. And so it has gone from being abandoned to being the haunted house to a beautifully restored home and event center for the city.
Mm-hmm. And we'll hope it's not too haunted now.
No, it was a faux haunt.
Okay.
It was a Halloween thing that our parks put on.
Right.
So I love seeing her now dressed as she should be. She's repaired and she looks beautiful, and she's in the setting where she was built.
Right. And you've done some things with the Black history of Ackworth as well, and with Bethel AME, and the Rosenwald School, obviously. Why don't you talk about some of those things?
Well, actually, it's your fault, Dr. Scott, that I'm involved at Bethel AME. You were active and were helping write some grants very early in my tenure in town. And so I just took what you had started and we worked through the universities. They have graduate Masters in Historic Preservation programs, and consequently we get the advantage of using their students under the direction of their professors.
So particularly Georgia State?
Georgia State was instrumental in Bethel. And so we were able to get it on the National Register. And then by that time, our Historic Preservation Commission was active, so we had it designated as a landmark for the city. And we still have been unable to get its restoration funded. Unfortunately, rural black churches have suffered greatly. The mega church is very attractive to the African American community. Our population, and you know it better than I, but I think was about 20% at the turn of the century, and it's down to about 7, if I understand now.
African American in Acworth?
In
the city
Acworth.
proper?
In the city proper. And so we haven't been able to get it restored, but we do, it's still intact and sits on the hill and is regal and overlooks the Julius Rosenwald school.
Talk about that, because you got a grant for them for that.
Yes, but we found out about it because of Dr. Scott. It's all your fault, Tom. Actually, you were doing an oral history at North Cobb High School.
Which you were responsible for also.
Right, it was a local area studies class that I had helped initiate. And so you always came and talked about Cobb County as part of that program, and then we would frequently be able to do oral histories in the class. And I chose to ask you to do an oral history on Evelyn Gregg, who was in her 90s, 80s, late 80s.
Probably in her, what could have been 80s or 90s.
80s or 90s at the school. And as you were talking to her, she mentioned that she went to the Rosenwald School. So by 2000, I was trying to gather information to co-write a book about a pictorial essay on Acworth. And we were reading the oral history and saw Rosenwald, and it went click, click. So by that time we had the internet and we could investigate how important it was. So we then realized it was a Julius Rosenwald school. In, oh gosh, I can't remember what year, almost 10 years ago, the Lowe's Home Improvement Company gave the National Trust for Historic Preservation $1 million to spend on Julius Rosenwald
I
schools.
think it's actually more than 10 years ago.
Oh goodness, I'm getting old.
Well, I have to check back, because we had a program at Kennesaw. We used to do a Jewish Life in the South series, and that was early 21st century, I think. We were doing those, and we had Alice Rosenwald.
I was there.
And yes, I know. And she came and visited the school. Along with some other places that we went to. And Peter Ascoli, I believe, was the
grandson.
Who was here for our conference.
That conference very much stimulated my interest. And we also, again, got to work with an academic program at Kennesaw State. Kennesaw State has a certificate of public history as one of their programs. And we have enjoyed the benefits because we were able, they have a class called Museum Studies. So that group has done not only our caboose display for the Dixie Highway, but also has done the display at the Rosenwald School. So that we were able to permanently document the advantages. And then Cobb Landmarks wrote a grant and acquired $50,000 to begin the rehab. We started it and could get the Rosenwald School back open because it has a wonderful story. It was condemned and slated to be demolished in 1948 by Cobb County Board of Education. They were going to, it was the last of that Jim Crow era where they were trying to do separate but equal. So they were going to tear down the Rosenwald School and build the Roberts School. And the black community here, as well as the white community, had actually raised funds. That was the unique part of the Rosenwald Fund, was that the community had to come up with land and had to come up with a good bit of the money, and then it could be matched and plans furnished by the Rosenwald School and technical expertise. So the community had been very active in getting the Rosenwald School in the 20s. So when it was scheduled 20 years later to be demolished, they asked the Board of Education to let them have it. So they dismantled it, numbered its planks and boards, loaded it onto wagons, and brought it down that school street and reconstructed it on the site that it is on now.
That is remarkable that they would have even numbered the boards as they took it apart.
Right. We've had to do some serious repairs, and I always go in and inspect with a flashlight. I haven't been able to find any of the numbers, but Amos Durr was a young man, and he tells me that that's what they did do.
And we interviewed Amos Durr, too, in
Yes.
that class.
We did, and we were also very fortunate because Amos and Evelyn could speak about the school. So it's an integral part of the school. Our African American churches are old and established with a really nice structure for their church, but they neither one have a social hall. And so the Rosenwald School has been the social hall for bereavement dinners, but they had their proms and Christmas parties. I've got some wonderful old pictures where there are people all dressed up for Sunday in a jukebox in the background. So it has a warm place in the heart of everyone in the city.
Well, now I know you do things other than historic preservation, because it seems like any time I call, you've got a Girl Scout troop coming through your house or somebody. Why don't you talk about some of the other things that you've been doing in the community?
Well, probably 10 or 12 years ago, I was asked to serve on the County Historic Preservation Commission. And that has been a lot of fun because regionally, preservation is more successful when approached at a more regional level. But I always felt like we needed to share that local history. That was something that you've spent your entire life, and you were my model. So your academic life was spent in local history, investigation, and documentation. And consequently, you infected me. So I was approached at North Cobb Christian and at North Cobb High School and with the Walker School to help them with local history. And through Cobb Landmarks, I initiated a program called Talking Walls. And that's a program that actually, week-long seminar for teachers for free, where we take them around the county and share many of our historic resources and give them techniques and ideas about how to integrate local history into the curriculum across all schools of thought. So I do a lot with the education. And what else do I do? Oh, I chair the I chair the city's tourism board. As historic preservation got to very firm ground in the city, through working with the ARC and the Cobb Travel and Tourism, I realized that the real money was in tourism. And so when asked to be a part of the Ackworth Tourism Board, I moved out of preservation and over to tourism. And heritage tourism is a very viable business in Georgia and in Ackworth. So
So restaurants, obviously, what attracts tourists to Ackworth, do you think?
Oh, we have now our Collins Avenue and a historic walking tour on your phone, which you can do independently or with a group. And we have the recreation of the lake. And our Lake Ackworth is indeed fortunate because it doesn't rise and fall the way that Allatoona does. It's safe from that because of the containment dam. And we also have an ordinance that keeps motorboats and skis and that sort of thing off the lake. So paddle boarding and kayaking are very popular here. And we have good fishing.
Okay.
And a beautiful beach.
Okay. So Ackworth has changed a lot during the time that you were here, and you've been largely responsible for many of the changes.
Oh no, just a part of the changes. But we have, I have always had a firm belief that there really are three fundamental parts for a good community, and that's really sensitive elected officials, and then they can influence our paid staff. But the bottom of that triangle is always community activism.
All right. Well, I think I've pretty well run out of my questions. Anything we should be talking about that you're doing that I don't know about?
Nothing except I'm finally Gigi. I'm a grandmother
Okay.
at almost 70, and I have the cutest little ginger-headed boy who is 13 months old in Mobile, and I travel there frequently to play with him.
And you were saying that your son has renovated a house himself.
Right, apparently, just like you infected me on local history, he's been infected for the economics of it, but he does enjoy it. So he has a historic home in Midtown on Old Government Street in Mobile, and it's an Airbnb if you're traveling.
Okay. Well, keep that in mind. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure. You've marked me.
No.
Yes, you
It didn't take
have.
much marking.
No, you taught me to share history as a story. You taught me that the local could easily be taken to demonstrate a national or even an international trend, and intertwine the families and why they came and what they built. So thank you so much for what you have done.